Thanks for tuning in today. I'm John Holmes with Holmes Hobbies, and we have a very special episode that I'm pretty excited about. We're going to do a lot of testing on the new Hobbywing X crawling system, which is a brushless system that they just released. I have this one a little bit early. It hasn't quite been released to the public, but I got my hands on one, and we're going to test it out, so stay tuned. All right, so in this video, we're gonna go over the X system from Hobbywing. I have a 2200 kV system here, and I also put together a Mamba X with a Puller Pro 2200, standard 540 size, and also a Sidewinder 4 with a Revolver 540 that is 1800 kV. Puller Pro is a 2200. So pretty all close in wheel speed there. I think they'll be good tests for each other. But they're all set in stock TRX4s. And the only changes to the TRX4s that I made, besides throwing a smaller LiPo battery in there, I'm using the 3500 milliamp hour 3S packs from Helios RC in all three of the rigs, exact same batteries. And I did end up throwing an SHV 500 servo in all the rigs because I killed all the stock servos on the TRX4. So that's really the only changes. Otherwise, they're stock. We'll have the first speed and second speed. It's kind of a heavy rig, so I think it'll give a really good representation of a lot of different scenarios that we can have these systems in. So we're gonna take it crawling out there. We're gonna go over all the specs of the systems, and then I will sum it up with a conclusion of all my thoughts. So to start out here, let's talk about the specs of the Hobbywing systems and the features that it has. I've already taken apart the motor, and the motor is actually a little bit smaller on the inside than a Castle Slate or a Puller Pro Stubby. So the rotor, the magnets in particular, are 14 millimeters long, as compared to the Puller Stubby, which is 17 millimeter long magnets, or the same as the Castle Slate motors or 1406 motor lines. Those are all 17 millimeter long rotor as well. So it's actually a little bit smaller than what we would call a 540 brushless motor. My 540 is actually larger. That's why I call the smaller one a stubby size. But at any rate, it's got a few millimeters less active motor inside. And we'll see if that actually makes a difference or not. Probably won't be able to tell in this weighted rig, maybe in second gear, but we'll see. They have rubber shielded bearings in the motor. I'm guessing just to keep water out of the motor, which it actually doesn't keep water out of the motor just because the water will get through the wires. It'll soak down the actual wire jackets themselves. It'll get in between the shaft of the motor and the bearing. So in my opinion, that may be a little extra fluid as far as being a water rig. You can always just throw some grease on the front side of that bearing to keep water out all the same, or actually do a little bit better job. So that's a feature, but whether or not that'll actually do anything is kind of for debate. The motor actually has an encoder on the back, which is kind of a big change from the industry. Instead of having a Hall effect sensor, and this is a 4-pole, mind you, instead of having a Hall effect sensor, 3 of them, it has an encoder in the back, which is probably a 10-bit encoder. It'll have better resolution than a 3-bit Hall sensor arrangement will. And then the controller is supposed to be field-oriented controlling. And I'm not quite sure if it is or not. We can just take Hobbywing's word for it that it is field-oriented controller. And I'm going to hook it up to the oscilloscope and show y'all exactly what it does. It's kind of interesting what it does to keep the velocity loop. I think they call it a velocity loop. It's supposed to keep its speed consistent no matter what your throttle position is. So if you tell it half throttle, it's going to keep at that half throttle speed no matter what your load is in the situation, which is kind of cool. It's going to be a new feature. I think that it's going to kind of shine on the rocks. It should at least be very evident when you're going downhill and when you're going uphill and kind of transitioning between that. At least that's what I think. So we should see a pretty marked change in the way that this drives. The PCB on the back of the motor is encapsulated, so it is waterproof essentially. You can dunk the motor and it'll still work just fine. Same for the speed controller, it's fully potted, and that's pretty much industry standard. All 3 combos that I'm going to be testing this day, they're all waterproofed as well as they can go. They can all go underwater and survive for long periods of time. They can still run. However, I will say it doesn't matter what the motor is. If you get it wet, you need to take it apart so it doesn't rust. There's going to be water getting in somewhere, whether it soaks in through the wires, whether it comes in from in between the bearing and the shaft itself, like the bearing race and the shaft. or just where the jackets come into the motors, there's going to be some sort of seepage. And at the very least, when your motor cools down, it creates a negative pressure inside if it's sealed too well. And that will even pull air into the motor, and air has moisture in it. And when you have that temperature change, it'll end up condensing inside the motor. So there's really no way around having a completely waterproof motor that does not need some sort of maintenance when you get it wet. So that's just something to be aware of. People call motors waterproof, and although yes, they will run underwater, it's not something that I would recommend that you get wet and then put away. The speed controllers, you can actually do that because they're so well encapsulated that there's really nothing to rust on the inside. But the magnets can rust on a motor, the steel laminations can certainly rust, and over time you can have some corrosion that builds up, and maybe your magnets are going to sling free, or you get enough corrosion that you actually have your magnet hit your stator as it's rotating around, and it'll throw a magnet off the rotor. There's just a lot of bad things that can happen if you let it sit like that. Your bearings will rust up over time. It doesn't matter with rubber shield or not, they will rust up over time. So you need to keep them lubed and dry. Really didn't need to go there, I think, for this video, but I always feel like I need to cover that issue. The next thing, they have a unique sensor wire on here. So it comes out of the motor in a basically just a wire with a little strain relief on it, and it goes straight into the ESC with a little strain relief, and then the plug is right in the middle, right here. And this is actually a pretty big section of cable that does not flex, and the sensor length does not match the length of the motor wires that were provided. Maybe that'll change for the ones that they're selling to customers. I don't know, but it's kind of hard to place. I did find it a little hard to place on the rig, slightly annoying. Being that it's a unique sensor wire, you're not going to be able to use any other motor. However, if this is a true field oriented controller, you won't be able to use any other motors either. So that's kind of a downfall of the system, is that you're stuck with this motor that they're giving you. So whatever choices that they say that you can have, that's the only thing that you can get. As opposed to the other systems that I'm testing today, they are universal motors. They will do anything that's censored or sensorless, brushed, brushless. It doesn't matter if it has a trapezoidal back EMF or if it has a sine wave back EMF, they will work on all motors pretty much. So that's a kind of a marked difference between this. This is a locked-in system. This is pretty much the combo that you get. Some people may not care about that. Some people may care. Yeah, just not a universal ESC. I did cover the rotor size on this. I will say that the diameter of the rotor was a little bit smaller than I expected for the length of the motor. It was, I believe, 14.5 millimeter rotor diameter. I do think that's the same as the Castle Slate motors as compared to my motors. Mine are 17.5 millimeter, and that does make a driving difference. There's a torque difference, kind of a feel, which is the reason why I went with a larger rotor in mine. But we'll see how it drives on the rocks. I'll say if there's any differences that I noticed right off the bat. So I guess at this point we're pretty much just going to go out to the rocks. We need to test it out. I have all three of my rigs in this fancy setup, the Krull controller, the Krull troller as it may be. And this will be fun to try to manhandle all three rigs and get them online. So we're going to go out to the rocks and we'll see you there. All right, we're out here at Capon Park in Columbia, Missouri, and we have our three systems to test. The Hobbywing X, we have a Sidewinder 4 combined with a Revolver 540, 1800 kV. The X is a 2300 kV system. The third system is the Castle Creations Mamba X combined with a 2200 kV Polar Pro 540 standard size. So we're going to start with the Hobbywing system and go up the rocks. And we'll just have to find a line that our tires and that the rigs can take. I haven't actually taken the TRX4s out to Capon yet. So we've got pretty smooth delivery of the RPMs on this sort of rock. You know, there's not a whole lot of variations. Not a whole lot of variations except for in our amounts of traction, but the load changes aren't too crazy. So you can see the vehicle speed is nice and smooth with a Hobbywing system. It kind of makes me look like a better driver than I really am, I would say. Just because it kind of keeps it nice and steady. And we'll probably see, let's just see how it does going back downhill. Pretty steady, just keeping an even trigger mount here. Nice and steady. All right, that was the X system. Now let's go for the X. I have a throttle curve on the X, and as you may or may not be able to tell, actually, I'll go back to the Hobbywing and show you the startup speed here. So that's pretty much our minimum startup. There we go. 350 RPM on the motor. That's our minimum startup speed. There we go. That's a nice slow startup. But with the X, it's got a much slower startup speed. And I have a Expo throttle on there as well, just using the stock Traxxas radios. But the Expo throttle combined with the resolution of the Mamba X gives a much more refined startup. I mean, we're basically seeing each pinion tooth go by here. So I'm not really sure what they were getting at with the Hobbywing X system as far as their smoothness and better control with the FOC and having the encoder on the motor. It obviously can have better resolution, but the low speed resolution just simply isn't there. So I'm just not really sure what they did with it, where they put it. Let's make sure my discs are all locked. So you can maybe tell there's a little bit more variation to the vehicle speed going through some of these sections. Maybe. We'll hit some edges of the rocks and just kind of see. It slows down a little bit more. It slows down a little bit more, but by no means is it difficult to control. It actually seems at low speed that I'm having a lot easier time controlling the X. It doesn't just jerk to life. Just a little bit more noise coming from the X. You probably can't hear it. Just a teeny bit more noise. So now we're downhilling. I'm giving steady throttle. It seems just as consistent on the downhill. So yeah, between those two systems, just on this little section, I would give the advantage to the Mamba X with the Polar Pro for sure. Just a lot smoother on the startup, a lot more tractable. Didn't have any disadvantages going downhill on throttle there, as you saw. All right, so this is the Sidewinder 4 with the Revolver. Low speed startup. There's our low speed startup. You can probably tell that is, again, slower than what the Axe system will do. We'll just set this Axe system next to it and show you. There's our minimum speed. There's our minimum speed. We'll go back to the Revolver. This is sensorless, mind you. As good, if not, yeah, better. So we got better sensorless startup. That's interesting. Now, one thing to note about the Revolver is that when it hits a load, it does not drop in RPMs as much as, say, a 4-pole or a 2-pole or pretty much any other brushless motor. It really kind of chugs through the load, which is what the Hobbywing X system is touting as like a velocity loop control, that it does not change speeds. And so in this regard, they kind of drive similar. Let's see if I can even get over this. I believe these tires are just a tiny bit shorter. Here we go. So no problems here. I'll just kind of speed up and get to the good stuff here. Even throttle amount, really not having any throttle dropping as far as like wheel speed is concerned. Must have not hit that the same. Let's try again. A little bit more noise from this system, for sure. And that's kind of a downside of sensorless operation, is there's usually some sort of audible noise while the ESC is trying to figure out where the motor is. All right, so we'll transition to downhill. I'm just gonna kind of give a little bit of throttle, and there's no free coasting. Maybe a little bit more variation to the vehicle speed itself as the load changes, but yeah, it seems to be locked in RPM just as well as the Hobbywing system was. I'm actually gonna back up and do that descent in second gear. Let's try that in second gear, or let's just flip it over. How about that? We'll just kind of hand to God this. So we'll try the descent in second gear. Go through this. Yeah, it likes to keep a pretty good, consistent RPM. So I can see the velocity loop in action. And I'll have to show you all this in a different section of rock, but the velocity loop also causes it to apply torque in a very unpredictable manner. Maybe kind of tough to show this in video. All right, so minimum throttle, second gear. All right, so I'm seeing a good bit of variation to the motor speed. So although it may have kind of a velocity loop, the second gear really kind of shows a lot more of what's going on. All right, so we're gonna go back to the X with the Puller Pro, and we'll just kind of get back up there and do the descent again. Yeah, this is gonna be a long video, isn't it? Oh, okay. This is when wheel speed helps. There we go. So we'll start again. I'm gonna take the same section. Oh, come on. Come on, John Robert. I'm gonna take the same section going downhill with just a little bit of throttle in second gear. And I think I have the drag brake set at 80% on this system, also on the Hobbywing system, and then 30%. Yeah, so there's more variation in second gear here of our RPMs going downhill. Certainly not uncontrollable by any means, but there's, yeah, a little bit more variation to our vehicle speed. You can see there. We'll go back into first, and then we will do the same with our Sidewinder 4 and Revolver. Yeah, a little bit more variation in the wheel speed as compared to the Hobbywing system in this case, in second gear. In first gear, I really could not tell a difference though. I really couldn't tell a difference. And so that's one of those things that it's going to depend on the vehicle weight, the vehicle gear down, your terrain that you're on, whether or not you're going to know if there's any difference between the rigs there. But in this situation, on this particular piece of rock, all in all, the Hobbywing was smooth, but it actually wasn't as smooth on the low end as the two castle-based DSE systems. Going downhill in second gear was really the only time that I could tell any sort of difference between having a velocity loop and having a normal, say, basically PWM or voltage controlled system as the castle. So no clear winner here, but a little bit of difference in the driving. So we'll go to the next part of the rocks and go from there. All right, for this test, we're going to go up to the ledge and just try to finesse our way around the edge of this ledge. Now with the Hobbywing system having the velocity loop, it wants to continue at whatever RPM that it's turning, and this will cause it to apply torque literally uncontrollably. Like I'm just barely giving throttle here, and it's wedging the rig in. If I get the tire wedged underneath, ooh, I mean, I'm kind of afraid for the rig. Like, right, oh man, it's hard to see, and there's no audible feedback of the motor working hard here. But it's just, man, it's just applying so much torque, trying to keep that consistent velocity, and I don't like it, honestly. I mean, it's smooth under light load changes for sure, but getting into a situation where you're bound down, the rig just doesn't have any force feedback. There's no modulation of the torque, and that's something that I really didn't realize that I valued so much until it's not there. It just seems kind of dangerous for the rig, honestly, that at any point in time, like if I got this tire wedged underneath just right, if there's a little softer foams, it just feels hard to control. Like I can't quite make the rig do what I want so much. It's not doing what I want, it's doing what it wants to do with the velocity loop. And in these sort of situations where there's a risk of being bound down heavily or falling into a crack, the velocity loop just doesn't let you choose how much torque you're putting into the system. It chooses for you based on how much velocity you're telling it to give. And yeah. And this isn't, I don't think, a climb that I can make easily. Well, let's just try it once. Have to come from a little different angle. Yeah, screw it. We're not gonna try that. All right, so now let's try the next system, the Mamba X and Puller Pro. High side, high center, a little more wheel speed, there we go. All right, so I'm gonna kind of get to the same situation here. We'll start a little lower. And I can edge up to this, and it just kind of stops. Once I get bound in at that wheel speed, it just kind of stops. And that lets me know that, hey, you're putting the system into a bind. You're putting your rig into a bind. Your tire is going to get wadded up. It doesn't just wad up. I have to add just a teeny bit more throttle. Not much, just a teeny bit, but that's learned throttle control over the years. I've definitely spent so much time crawling that I've learned this sort of throttle control to get around binds without, say, popping out when it gets unloaded. So I am having to modulate my finger a little bit to do this smoothly, but not much, honestly, not a whole lot. So we'll go just kind of smoothly, yeah, see, it stops. And I can say, do I want to put more torque on the system? Do I need more throttle? Yeah, sure, I'm gonna do it. And we can just keep creeping right through. So no velocity loop, obviously, but a lot more tractable as far as the torque delivery. Same thing here. So I'm getting that front tire wedged down and the system stops. It doesn't just try to break my rig. I'm kind of honestly a little nervous about how much force this is putting on, but for the sake of testing, we'll just kind of show you. And I can get it to move, no problem, just add a little bit more throttle to it. But I choose how much the rig is getting loaded down, and to me that seems to be a lot more important in this sort of situation. Again, I didn't realize it until you don't have it. It's one of those things, I guess. We're just gonna load that in one more time. All right, and I'm gonna try the normal climb. Let's just see if we can do it. It's kind of a tough section. I think the center of gravity may be a little too tall with TRX4, but we'll see. Yeah, yep. And as you saw right there, gobs of wheel speed immediately when I asked for it. I haven't been able to show it yet, but the Hobbywing system has a pretty soft torque delivery. It spools up relatively slowly. At least in comparison to these systems. All right, so Revolver, SW4 and Revolver. This is sensorless, mind you. So I'm going to just kind of creep in, try to avoid my bumper there. So as soon as it gets bound down, the wheel speed does slow. It pretty much stops. But you can hear, in this system, since there's more audible noise, you can literally hear the strain right there. Oh, it's trying. So I add a little bit more throttle and it starts spinning again, just a little bit. But that tire, oh, it's so wedged down. Now look at that sensorless control though. It's still amazing to me. I've been running this system multiple times a week, hours a week. And this being sensorless just is absolutely amazing. So when I drive the Hobbywing, and I look at the marketing and the fancy field oriented control, the encoder that they've got on the motor, I just have to wonder, what is it actually giving me? Because I can't tell compared to any other sensorless system, well, today at least, or even, you know, any sensored or sensorless system. I just can't tell that there's an actual improvement. The big difference that I can tell was, you know, just second speed on the rock going downhill, that there was a little bit more lock to the speed, and that I am not in control of the torque delivery. That's what I can really tell. And in a lot of cases, I don't think it would really matter about that. It just depends on how much of a torque load you're putting on it. But a situation like this, where I'm getting it bound in and I'm at risk of being able to break parts, if I can't control the torque delivery, then I literally can't control whether I'm willingly breaking my rig. And I'm really trying to get past that. You know, it's a new system, and I'm really trying to get past that, but I just can't. I've spent so much time crawling and learning how a normal voltage control system acts that I already have my throttle finger, you know, dialed in. I have that throttle control ready, so that when I get out of a bound down situation, I know to let off the throttle a little bit so that it doesn't just roll away in RPMs. Yeah, see, no, like this is really, really loaded down, and I'm telling it, give me a little bit more. I'm pushing more into it. Just as tractable as can be, just controllable. As far as controllability between all three systems in this sort of situation, they're all controllable for sure. Still seeing a little bit better low speed control out of the Castle ESC systems. Still seeing a lot more of the torque control with the Castle systems as well, and it's going to be hard for me to get over the lack of torque control in this Hobbywing, but we're going to keep testing and using this crawl controller, the crawl crawler controller here, which is yeah, maybe we'll throw this and see if it boomerangs when we're done, right? Situation, we're at a descent. I'm in first gear. This is the Hobbywing system, and I'm just giving it as minimum of throttle as I can. Minimum. I can kind of hear the pinion bouncing back and forth. Actually, that's how you know that the Hobbywing system is at the minimum throttle point, is that it'll actually bounce and vibrate the pinion. So downhill descent, nice and tractable, nice and tractable. I would kind of like a little slower crawl, although this is obviously very slow, but it does not get slower than this. This is as slow as it goes. It's either off or it's going that speed. Tractable, absolutely fine. In this sort of situation, it feels good, it drives good. All right, we'll get it out of the way here. Next up, Mamba X, Puller Pro 2200. We'll just kind of get to the ledge here. And we'll just minimum throttle. Now, you can kind of hear the motor working. I'll get close for a second so you can hear. Maybe you can hear. But the motor, or the ESC, tries to work the motor before it actually starts spinning, and that's a good hallmark of having that low speed control. That was a little bit of tire slip there. That wasn't actually the rig free coasting. So we'll get into a little bit more load in this situation. I actually do have to add more throttle to keep it rolling. But instead of just having kind of an on-off minimum speed, I'm able to literally go one pinion tooth at a time here. Just tick, 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 tick. So I'm coming up to a little load change, so I'll probably have to let off just a little bit, letting off, and just, right. So there's more throttle control with my finger, trying to get this to emulate what the Hobbywing is doing. I'm having to do more work with my finger to match the load changes. So it doesn't look as smooth, I guess, but to me, the feeling of driving it is actually smoother because I'm in control. It tells me when there's a load change by the velocity change of the truck. And maybe not everybody's into that. Maybe people don't want to know. I don't know. I like to know what's going on with my rig. All right, so we'll get up to this. I'll minimum throttle and we'll get it rolling. There we go. Like, yeah, a little tire slip in there. So I'm having to work a little harder. Actually, I want to try this again. I'm having to work a little harder with the sensorless system on this downhill descent to get it to emulate what the Hobbywing was doing, because it wants to start up at just a little bit higher RPM at first, pointing downhill, but then I can back off and just creep downhill. Now when it hits the bottom here, it's probably gonna stop, maybe, or it's just gonna keep chugging along. That's kind of the beautiful thing about the Outrunner, about the Revolver, is that it has so much torque that once it's spinning, it'll try to keep its own RPM. However, it still responds to load changes, either audibly or by dropping an RPM, depending on how much the load change is. Just as tractable. And I haven't changed my finger at all, actually, on this particular one. I've got it spinning nice and slow. I could even go a little bit slower, it looks like. Sensorless, slower than the Hobbywing. Just amazing. Noisier though. That would be the downside of this system, is that it's obviously noisier. But when you're looking for performance, sometimes you have to have some trade-offs. You always have to have trade-offs. What am I talking about? So we could just I could keep doing that for probably 5 more minutes to get a few more feet. All right, yeah, so we'll call that good now here, and we'll meet you over at the hobby house now. All right, so we had our fun on the rocks. I didn't actually see the differences that I thought that I would. There's definitely like some hold brake action going on with the rig. It's pretty strong. And so I wanted to look at it on the oscilloscope and see exactly what was going on. So if we can zoom in on this screen, I'm gonna do a little bit of tests and just kind of show you what they're doing to kind of get this hold brake and maybe shed a little bit of light on what they're doing for the RPM matching, the velocity loop. So we're sitting at rest right now, and maybe you know how to read an oscilloscope. Every phase right now has an identical AC waveform, a 50% duty cycle being put onto it. So there's no work being done, there's no amp draw being done right now. But as soon as I start to turn the wheels, it pushes back, and it may not show up on the oscilloscope right now, but it is an active sort of pushing, and it's driving it kind of like a stepper motor, to where it has this AC waveform. I believe it's 14 kilohertz. Let's see, I'd say in 12 kilohertz right now, so somewhere between 14 and 12. So it's got this waveform that it's putting on top of the motor at all point in time, but it's only doing work when the rotor gets out of alignment, which is pretty cool. So it's an active brake, but it's not an active brake that's burning when it doesn't need to do work. Pretty slick implementation. Now let's give it a little bit of throttle, and then we'll do a single shot. There we go. So I need to give y'all a little bit more view of what's going on. We'll try that one more time. There we go, single shot. So all 3 phases are getting powered at the same time, but as you can see, they're essentially rolling the duty cycle between the phases like a typical 6-step commutation. However, it's got what looks to be like a floating point to it. It's like a virtual floating point, so that they're getting the FOC and they're essentially powering all 3 phases at the same time, but in a different vector to make sure that they're torque vectoring properly. Essentially, you need to have your amp draw on the stator to be orthogonal from your rotor position, and that way you're always creating the best amount of torque possible. I can't tell just from the oscilloscope whether they're really doing that or not, but I don't think that it really matters in the long run. So they're using this as advertising, that it's field-oriented control, and maybe it is. It probably is, since they're advertising it. But really, was there a noticeable difference on the rocks? That's kind of my question. I think we're pretty much done with the oscilloscope now, so I'll boot this down. So, what are my thoughts on the rocks? Like, how did this actually perform? I was surprised that I did not see as much of a big difference as I thought that I would. The downhill performance, at least in first gear with this rig, wasn't markedly different. It didn't free coast much less than any other rig. Both the Mamba X system and the Sidewinder 4 seemed to hold a really good speed when you were pointing downhill. When I got into second gear on the rig, it free coasted more with the Mamba X and the Polar Pro being a 4-pole motor, but with the Sidewinder 4 and the Revolver being a 14-pole, there was basically no free coasting at all. And so the advantage of holding an equal RPM on this system really didn't show up as much as I thought that it would. I really thought that I would be able to tell more that the system was doing work. Now, there was a noticeable difference in the velocity of the rig. So the rig itself, more or less, would roll very smoothly through sections, and when it hit a bump, it wouldn't, slow down so much. But that actually caused some problems. If I'm doing really smooth crawling, if I'm just trail riding, it was nice and smooth, very easy to drive. But as soon as I got bound down into a section to where I needed to have some modulation of torque, I had no torque modulation. The velocity loop was trying to keep that speed going, and to do that when you get like a tire, bound down into a crack, it was just hammering the torque on the rig. And it actually made me uncomfortable in a couple of positions to where I thought, man, I'm going to break this rig. And I have never thought that with any of my other systems, that the TRX4 was going to get broken. It's a really stout rig. I mean, I could throw it off the table right now and not even worry about it getting broken. But I had major concerns about not being able to modulate my torque, and I just couldn't get past it. I've been crawling since 2002, so I'm like 16 years into it, learning how to drive, learning my throttle control and how to match the terrain with my finger. You get bound down, you give it a little bit more throttle. When it pops out, you give it a little bit less throttle so it doesn't just kind of run away. And so for myself, it was extremely difficult to get past that I didn't have control over the torque. So for me, this system, I don't like the way that it drives, at least when I get bound down. In the easy driving sections, it really didn't seem to drive much different. So it was nice and smooth. The startup was decent. On the bench, it starts up about 350 RPM. 420 is a little bit easier to hit, but 350 RPM was the minimum that I could get on it. It does not start up any slower. And that was evident on the rocks as well, that it would kind of jerk to life when we were on flat ground with no load as compared to the other systems. A Puller Pro combined with the Mamba X will start up about 120 RPM. I haven't actually done the RPM startup tests on the sensorless Revolver with a Sidewinder 4, but as evident on the video, in use, it seemed to actually be the slowest crawling of them all. I mean, it was kind of a toss-up between the Puller Pro and the Sidewinder 4 with the Revolver, but all in all, I thought that we would have a lot more smoothness on the low end than this was giving me. Once it was bound down in the rocks, like just a little bit of load in the rocks, it was plenty smooth. It was still plenty smooth. I'll certainly give it that. Going downhill, the transition, it was still plenty smooth. But I could still notice that the startup resolution was simply not there compared to the other two systems. It was very obvious to me. I am really picky. I'm probably the pickiest person on the planet when it comes to rock crawler motors and ESCs. So take it with a grain of salt. I think by any means, most people are going to be pleased with this system. But when you get really bound down, any sort of competition setting, I would not feel comfortable with this at all. It would just make me nervous that I'm going to accidentally slip into a crack. If my focus of watching the terrain slips for half of a second, then it's gonna fall into a crack and it's just gonna jerk the tire and break some parts. Or going up any slopes. I didn't find any slopes today where I got a back tire caught. But if you get up into a section and a back tire gains traction, it will flip the rig over. I did that off camera yesterday when I was crawling it. Couldn't find a right section to do it today, but that is also a problem, that since there's no torque modulation to it, it will flip the rig over backwards with pretty much no warning, and that's not something that I would want to recommend for competition. For the average guy though, even for a newbie, I think the system would be pretty good. However, if you're a newbie and you learn to drive on this, then you're not learning the throttle control that would translate over to every other system. And so that's kind of a downfall to it, is that it's giving you velocity control and making the rig look really smooth. For scaled videos, I think it would actually be kind of nice to have, but the velocity control didn't seem any better than the Revolver by any means. Now, it was quieter than the Revolver, so it certainly has that. That's an advantage of the system, is that it was nice and quiet. Not much quieter than the Puller Pro combined with the Mamba X though, so it wasn't really a marked difference there. But I'm actually having a really hard time pinning down whether I should say a yes or a no to this system. There's so many upsides and downsides at the same time that I can say that it's just not going to be for me. I don't like the way that it drives. I really get my rigs bound down a lot. I like to push my rigs and kind of push my driving ability so much. I've been doing it for a long time. I get bored if I'm just tooling around. So it just doesn't suit my driving style, I feel. And my throttle finger and my brain is so programmed into having some sort of feedback of the torque load that it highly bothered me. It highly bothered me. But if we go through the other features of it, easily programmable. It has the Bluetooth connection where you can go through. It doesn't have throttle curves on it though, and that's kind of a big deal in that if I wanted to smooth out the throttle response, I can't do it on this. So it was far jumpier on the low end. Not only the minimum startup speed, but just the general low end application of throttle was jumpier. It also had much less punch on acceleration. Markedly, I noticed that there was a lot less punch on acceleration. Maybe it's because the motor it's got the staggered pole on the rotor. That's going to be less efficient. It's not going to be able to put down the torque that a normal rotor would be able to in the same stator setup. There's certainly that. That's another downside. It doesn't have the punch. So if you're in a competition setting, again, I just don't think it would be a good suit for that. Easy to program. It was certainly lacking in peppiness there. The low speed control, it was good enough, but certainly not as good as the other systems, which is kind of a surprise. It's got the encoders, so I mean, what are they getting out of the encoders if they don't have better low speed control? I don't know. That's a good question that maybe they can answer. It's an average size of system and weight of system, so you're not going to get a smaller system going with this. It's about the same size as a Mamba X or a Sidewinder 4. It does not have a fan. It ran about the same temperature as well. The Sidewinder 4 combined with the Revolver is a little bit hotter running. Those are always hotter running because it's a faster commutation rate, so there is going to be that. But that was like 10 degrees difference. The system was running it right at about 100, and I think we were in the 95 degrees outside or 90 degrees outside, so just a little over ambient for this. Same for the Mamba X with the Puller Pro. Both of those were right at about 100 degrees for both of those. The motor on the Revolver was, I think, 115 degrees, and then the ESC was 110. So just a little bit more heat on that system, but for the control that it gives, that's a trade-off for me. If I'm going to choose any of the systems, I'm going to go for that Revolver, unless I need something that's really quiet. If I'm in like a state park and I don't want to annoy people, then between the three systems that I tested, the Puller Pro combined with the Mamba X, that's probably going to be my choice, or even a BLE, and we throw it in a dithered mode so it's even quieter and still keeps that good resolution. But I'm just not going to choose this system. I hate to say it. It's a really good attempt. Hobbywing made a really good attempt. They've thrown a whole lot of features at this. And but at the end of the day, the features didn't seem to deliver like I thought that they would. And that kind of bothers me, that they really did so much engineering and they threw a lot of new technology at this that by all of their marketing standards is, market changing. I don't see it changing the market, unfortunately. They did not match the smoothness of existing systems, does not match the smoothness of a brushed system by any means, even the cheapest brushed system, as long as the ESC is decent enough for low speed control. Get a Hobbywing 1080. I think that's what it's called, the 1080 speed controller, the little cheap brush speed controller, and then one of my Trailmaster Sport motors, and you will have better low speed control and just as good at braking downhill. At a far cheaper price. So I'm kind of having a hard time to find where this fits in, and that bothers me because they've done a great job at the attempt. It's a solid system, but there's just a couple of downfalls like that, the lack of punch, the lack of torque control that really just kind of hammers home that the system just isn't for me. Dang. I don't know what else to say about it. It's kind of disappointing. I'm not going to be keeping the system. I'm going to send it on to another tester and let him have some fun with it. Maybe it's going to be for him. So I'm sure there'll be a lot more videos coming out, good review videos of this. So don't just take my word for it. This is just one opinion of one guy. I do believe that I'm about the pickiest guy in the world. So, take it with a grain of salt again. That's about the only thing I can say. Anything else that I need to recap with? I really don't think so. Bottom line is really going to be the system isn't for me. I would not recommend it for any sort of competition crawling because of lack of torque control. That really bothers me. I just can't get past that, unfortunately. I'm almost turning red. It's like I need to get past this somehow, and it's like I just can't. I'm too ingrained in my ways, man. I'm too ingrained in what I expect out of a control, I guess. But if you're going to be trail running, if you're a newbie, yeah, man. If you got the spinning cash to try this and you're a Hobbywing fan, I would say go ahead and pick it up, and you're not going to be disappointed. you know, there's certainly that to it. But if you've already got experience crawling, I think you might be disappointed in a lot of ways, and you may be along the same lines of me where you need that torque control. You expect that torque control. You need some sort of either audible feedback or some sort of RPM change when you hit a load to tell you that, hey, your rig's getting bound down, man. You might break some parts. So that's, yeah, that's about all I can say about it. If y'all have any questions, if something that I didn't cover on this, feel free to post them down below. And we're going to be releasing multiple videos in this that goes over everything in entirety. So keep an eye out for those. If you're not subscribing, go ahead and subscribe. Let's see, what's the other thing that you got to do? You got to check some other box to make sure that you get updates from us, whatever that is. I don't care. But yeah, if there's anything else, let us know in the comments. And I thank you for tuning in today. Have a good one.